All right, when I'm super stuck on a question, sometimes I will play this game, or when I have a friend or somebody I love who's stuck on a question, we're talking about it and gaming it out for them. I'll play this little game that I call Maximum Basement, Maximum Ceiling. And we start by considering option A, and we think, what is the very best thing that has any reasonable chance of happening? And what is the very worst thing that has any reasonable chance of happening? And then we work our way back toward the middle. We're like, what's probably the most likely positive-ish outcome, and what's the most likely negative-ish outcome? You kind of develop this profile, this almost bell curve, and you can kind of look at the shape of that bell curve mentally when you're done working over one option really well. And then once you kind of got that in your mind, you go and you run the other option, maximum awesome, maximum awful, most likely positive-ish outcome, most likely negative-ish outcome. And you can almost chart that in your brain on another bell curve. And then it gets real simple, because at some point you realize that if you pick, say, option A, almost certainly nothing really that good is very likely to happen. You're likely to pick up some very modest gains, but you are putting into play something catastrophic that doesn't come into play if you choose, say, option B, where the worst thing that could happen is, you lose a little face, you burn a little time, you burn a little money, but there are a lot of good things that could come out of it as well. Sometimes we just get a little too close to the math problem. That's a phrase that one of my friends uses all the time for when we're not running the equation very carefully and we've just been mulling over and stewing on it for too long. We're letting emotion get too involved, and then we become more likely to do things, to pick options that really aren't particularly good for us and that are very, very, very risky. I think Haman could have benefited from playing maximum basement, maximum ceiling before he decided to kill the Jews. Because I've been sitting here running this equation on his behalf for the last 24 hours, getting ready for this conversation. And true, we've got the benefit of hindsight now that we're in Esther chapter 7, but maximum basement for option A for Haman, which is cook up a plan to kill all the Jews because Mordecai hurt your feelings and you just don't like the Jews. Maximum basement here is you overplay your hand with the king, you burn the relationship, you demonstrate that you're bloodthirsty and vindictive, and you introduce that into the relationship. And if anything goes south, well, now the king, who from time to time does do pretty weird, pretty violent stuff, he might look at you and say, well, since you're into that kind of thing, this will be your punishment. There's a whole lot of downside in option A for Haman, which is cook up a plan to use the authority of the king to kill all the Jews. But now let's think about modest downside. Let's say he tries it, the king thinks about it, and he really isn't that into the idea, and he's like, I don't know, come to me with better ideas, man. Then that's about it. You lose face with the king. You take a step back in terms of your trust and your authority in that position. But now let's work maximum upside if you're Haman. What is it that you get out of all of this? Well, it's pretty huge. Because remember, the deal is not just that Haman would get to kill the Jews. That's not the deal that he struck. Yeah, the Jews would get killed, according to this, but also they would get completely plundered. Now, the Jews are doing pretty well, in part because they've been funded from the state treasury by the last couple of kings. Cyrus had very favorable economic policies toward the Jews during their rebuilding phase, and Darius even more so. He doubled down on Cyrus's edict once he found the lost order in the archives of Ecbatana, and he came back and was like, all right, well, I'm going to fund this thing myself then. And so there would have been a lot of royal money flowing into Jerusalem, and surely that made Haman lick his chops and think about what he could get out of the deal. But another reason that Haman would be really working that end of the equation on option A here, the positive end that is, and thinking, man, maximum ceiling, is we get all that royal money that made its way to Jerusalem, but also we get all the resources that have been grown from Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem and the surrounding hill country had been resting fallow for 70 years. It's a really curious thing, the way this plays out from the end of the 600s and into the 500s BC. Remember, it's 586 that Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian, the predecessor people group of the Persians, it's 586 that Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem and hauls almost everybody away into captivity. It's then 516, 70 years later. That's the number the prophets had predicted, and indeed that's the way it worked out, because the second temple that got rebuilt is dedicated in 516 BC. And there is a principle in the Old Testament about letting the land rest, and this idea of 7 and 70, these numbers factor into these cycles of rest. And right at the end of 2 Chronicles, which is the last details about the stuff just before what we get into in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, it says in verse 20, chapter 36, he, that's Nebuchadnezzar, carried into exile the Babylonian remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. Here it is. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests all the time of its desolation. It rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So this land, which has been really fruitful for a really long time, flowing with milk and honey, has been overworked. It's been pushed hard. But now, straight up, the Bible says that it got a really nice break during these 70 years between the Babylonian conquest in 586 and the dedication of the Second Temple in 516. Why does this matter? Because we're talking about Haman running the equation and his maximum basement, maximum ceiling, and considering the option of doing this to the Jewish people. The maximum ceiling is increased by the fact that this land hasn't been touched. It's almost been returned to a virgin state, ready to be harvested, and all of that wealth is just sitting there to be taken, with only a small group of people having lived there since the return, and no doubt they had made themselves very rich off of the abundance of this well-rested land. So again, that plunder is going to pop in Haman's mind because no doubt the Jews are doing super, super well. And I think another reason that Haman was looking at the maximum ceiling here really closely and maybe not paying close enough attention to the maximum basement side of the equation was because of how the Jews had conducted themselves while they were in exile. In Jeremiah 29, this is one of the most famous passages in the whole Old Testament. This happens before the Jews are taken away into captivity. And the prophet, through God, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. God says, go and prosper in the city. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And it looks like indeed the exiles went and did that for multiple generations. And so my guess is that when Haman is running his maximum basement, or maybe he didn't really look very closely at that, but maximum ceiling part of the equation here, he's not just a Jew hater who's like, I just want to kill the Jews because I don't like them. That was part of it. But I don't think he would have been so excited about that if there weren't these factors that I've mentioned that no doubt played into enriching the Jews and putting a bigger target on their backs. And so even though it's absolutely evil, deplorable, murderous, and wicked in every way, it's not hard to see how the equation was working out for Haman. He just got fixated on the upside of this thing and saw all of the opportunity that was in front of him in what he would have if he could manipulate the king into killing this group of people. And probably that bid that Haman made for what would be about $250 million, I had estimated, probably that bid looked really generous to King Xerxes, but I don't think Haman is making that bid if he didn't know for sure that he was going to earn all of that and a whole lot more back in what he could gain from the plunder of the Jewish people empire-wide after they were eliminated. But back to this maximum basement, maximum ceiling question as we sort of pause here in the middle of Esther chapter 7 with a bag over Haman's head in the narrative, waiting to see what his fate will be. I think at that moment, as his face was covered, as the black bag, I assume it's a black bag, slipped over his head, I wonder in that moment if he thought to himself, well, I did consider this would be the worst possible outcome of this ploy, and unfortunately it looks like the roll of the dice didn't favor me this time around. Or I wonder if he was completely shocked and had never in any way considered, because of his hubris, the possibility that this could be a grand reversal that could boomerang on him, and that by making this big move, he was pushing all of his wealth chips, all of his reputation chips, and all of his life chips to the middle of the table to take a swing at making this ploy work out. Had he thought this through, had he gamed it out? My honest guess would be no. I think he was so emotionally charged by hatred, so blinded by pride, and so greedy in the pursuit of ill-gotten gain that moment that bag went over his head was a complete shock to him in every way. I keep promising that we're going to round out this chapter and find out his fate, and I think next time around I'm actually going to pay that off. As I'm recording this, over the beginning of last weekend, I started to publish that really cool map of the Achaemenid Empire that I've been working on, and I've been sharing that with everybody who's currently supporting the program at any level on any platform. The feedback on that has been really nice. Thank you. I'm glad you like it. I'm already working on the next one, which will also go to everybody who's supporting in any way. It's just some way that I have to say thank you for making this thing go, because this thing only exists because of you. So thank you again. Hope you enjoy the map. Rounding out Esther 7 next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.